Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Good evening to those who are here live and those who are here via Zoom. So I thought before I go further, actually, I posted the link in the Dropbox link in the chat of the in the chat function for those who haven't managed to download it, and I'll put it on the YouTube link also. I thought that this Parsha, this Sedra, is a fitting one to look at the whole of Sefer Bereishit and try and understand the role of Sefer Bereishit. What is Sefer Bereishit for? What's its purpose? What are the themes that run through it? Now, this isn't an original topic. It's one addressed by Rashi right at the beginning of the Torah. The very first Rashi in the Torah is bothered by this question. Why do we need Sefer Bereishit? What do we need it for at all? And Rashi actually asks not just Sefer Bereishit, but even the very beginning of Shmos, the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim. Rashi doesn't understand why we need it for either. Let's have a look at Rashi. Omar Rabbi Yitzchak, said Rabbi Yitzchak. We don't know, by the way, who this Rabbi Yitzchak is, as is well known. He's not a figure that we are aware of from other Midrashim or other sources. Omar Rabbi Yitzchak, Lo yad tzorich lahaschil es haTorah, elo me'achodesh hazeh lachem. The Torah should have only begun from Achodesh hazeh lachem. She mitzvah shonosh in Stavi Yisrael, which is the first mitzvah that the Jewish people were commanded in. Or Matam Pasach Bereishit. So why did it start with Bereishit? So Rashi asks, what do we need the whole of Sefer Bereishit for? And indeed, the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, a very remarkable question. Surely, it should have started from Achodesh hazeh lachem, the first mitzvah given to Klal Yisrael as a people. So after Hashem let Moshe know that that's it, they're going to be leaving Egypt, he gives the first national mitzvah, Chodesh hazeh lachem, Rosh Chodashim. There are a couple of mitzvahs that appear in Sefer Bereishit, but these aren't given on a national level, they're given on an individual level. So we have the mitzvah of Bris Milah, we have the mitzvah of Puru, we have of having a family, we have the mitzvah of Git HaNosha, the prohibition of Git HaNosha, that's really about it. So these mitzvahs are given to Noach, or to Odom, or to Yaakov and his descendants, almost as individuals. But the first national mitzvah given is HaChodesh hazeh lachem, Rosh Chodashim, the mitzvah of the calendar, Jewish calendar, and the calculations of the lunar cycle and its alignment with the solar system and so on. So Rashi says that's where the Torah should have started. And his answer is Mishum koyach mas of higid la'amoi, lo seis lahem nachlas goyim. So he quotes the pasuk in Tehillim Kuf Yud Aleph, koyach mas of higid la'amoi. Hashem told his people the power of his deeds, lo seis lahem nachlas goyim, to give to them the portion of the nations. She'im yomru umas ha'olam Yisrael. If the nations of the world say to Yisrael, listimatem, you are thieves, bandits, shekovashtem artsos shivas goyim, that you conquered the land that really belongs to the 7 Canaanite nations. No, this isn't true. They can respond, everything in the whole world belongs to Hashem. Who borrow the Nosnal Asher Yashar Be'inov? He gave it to the ones who are Yashar Be'inov, who are straight in his eyes, who are fitting in his eyes. But it's his will to give it to them, and now it's his will to take it from them and give it to us. So this is a fascinating and difficult Rashi. Both the question of Rashi and the answer of Rashi are difficult. Rashi's Rashi's pre-thought that it was feasible that the whole of Sefer Bereishit should be missed out is remarkable. It's unbelievable. I mean, could we really have managed without Sefer Bereishit? Surely Sefer Bereishit contains the fundamentals of faith, the belief in creation of the world and the description of it. The story of the Avos and Imois, the founding of our people. How on earth could we have managed without Sefer Bereishit? It's a truly remarkable question. And Rashi's answer is also a little difficult. That the purpose of this is really to do with our right to Eretz Yisrael. That's Rashi's answer to the question. Our response to how we could be granted Eretz Yisrael is only because of the Torah, in which Hashem says, "I have the right to give the world to the land to who I want to give it." What we do see in Rashi's question is a different picture of what Torah is about. Rashi's understanding is that Torah is about instruction. It has to be hands-on, fact-based. It has to be tangible instruction for us human beings. And therefore, Sefer Bereishit, as interesting and important as it may be in other respects, nonetheless, there's nothing there which contains actual mitzvahs for Klal Yisrael, or very little there, other than the couple of things that we mentioned. And therefore, Chodesh Zalachem, which is the first mitzvah, is the real start of the Torah. It's often been pointed out that there's many translations to the word Torah, but one translation of the word Torah is hurrah, instruction. And Rashi understands that it's instruction. Instruction has to be something which is lemaisa, a specific mitzvah. Rashi's answer also indicates to us the centrality of Eretz Yisrael to the Torah. It's very interesting. The Torah is a book in which, in some respects, the main character is missing, because the whole Torah, one way of looking at the Torah, if we think about the Torah, is a book of preparation or journey towards Eretz Yisrael, and we don't quite get there. The story ends on the cusp of Eretz Yisrael. So one way of thinking about Chamisha Chumshei Torah is the groundwork and the foundation, which now explains the reality of where we are. So where are we as a Jewish people post Chamisha Chumshei Torah, living in Eretz Yisrael? So that's the what it means to be Am Yisrael. We're living in Eretz Yisrael. That's where the readers of the Torah are as they read, as they live the life of Yeshua, Shotim, and Malachim, and so on. And the Torah is about the book about how we got there. But where are we now? We're now in Eretz Yisrael. So if the Torah is the build-up to Eretz Yisrael, the most significant character, as it were, of the Torah is the hidden character who doesn't really appear that much, which is Eretz Yisrael, because everything is about making our way there. But most of the Torah is whilst we're not there. So it's a description of the journey of the Jewish people towards Eretz Yisrael, ending, okay, now we're about to enter Eretz Yisrael. We're now living in Eretz Yisrael, therefore we know where we are. And therefore Rashi's answer to the question is, this is part of the Torah's mission of preparing for Eretz Yisrael. So Sefer Bereishit is about a bris that was formed between Hashem and a certain individual and family, eventually nation of human beings. We've spoken quite a lot in this series, I think 2 or 3 weeks, we spoke about the concept of bris, a covenant that's formed, of which Eretz Yisrael is a very integral part. Eretz Yisrael is connected to that covenant, and the whole Torah is a story about our right to Eretz Yisrael, the reason Eretz Yisrael is granted to us, the connection that's formed. The story of the Dor HaMabul and the Dor HaFloga is about why humanity as a whole, the project of having a covenant with the whole of humanity doesn't work, and therefore the covenant needs to be narrowed off. Again, remember our shiur about covenants, in which we said Adam Harishon, Noach have a covenant with Hashem. What it means to be Jewish is to have this unique and specific covenant. So the general human covenant remains, but was diminished because of the story of the Mabul and the Torah Floka and so on. So this is all part of the story of the preparation for ownership of Eretz Yisrael, and therefore this is Rashi's answer to the question why we need why is it so important for us to understand. I guess we can expand Rashi not just to talk about the creation of what gives Hashem the right to allocate it, but what caused him to choose to allocate it to us. This is the story of Sefer Bereishit. So this is the rough outlines of what Rashi is saying. We'll have to understand this in a little bit more detail, because this is truly remarkable. Yes.
If they said your thing is you need to stole the land, this is not going to answer that question, then, is it? Because they don't believe in the Torah.
So the question that was asked, and actually someone posted me a question on the chat group also. Who is this answer given to? Is this given to the Ummah Ha'olam, or is this given to Jews? Because the Ummah Ha'olam don't believe in the Torah. So possibly the answer, you're correct. Possibly this is given to the Jews, so we know that what we're doing is not unjust. The Torah cares about us living amongst many things, a spiritual life and so on. But one of the things is meant to live a moral life and an ethical life, and therefore we maybe would be bothered by the claim listed matter. Maybe it would hit home and we'd wonder what gives us the right. And therefore the Torah's response is, don't worry about it, this is an answer given to us. An alternative understanding is that no, the Torah speaks to the whole of humanity. The whole of humanity is there are humans who will accept the Torah, there's humans who won't accept the Torah, but it's there as a guide ultimately to the whole of humanity. And therefore there's an expectation that the response to the Torah should even be one that answers the rest of the world. Look, we live in a world where at least nominally more than half the world's population accept some version of the Torah, and therefore maybe there's an expectation. We're speaking in our Sunday morning series of philosophy. To what degree is your average human expected to arrive at the truths of the Torah or to know them, but maybe this is something given as an answer to everyone. I mean, you're right. Part of the lack of clarity of Rashi. Well, had the Torah not contained Sefer Bereishit, maybe they would have asked the question, even if they have a belief in the Torah. Therefore, there needs to be this response. It's interesting. In a moment, we'll see that how this relates to Torah SheBa'al and Torah SheBa'al Peh. But it is an interesting fact that Torah SheBa'al is far more universally accessible and believed in than Torah SheBa'al Peh. So if this is aimed at a broader population, then maybe they, without it being written in the Torah, they would say, we deny your right to Eretz Israel. You're telling us that God gave it to you, or you've got this oral story of Torah SheBa'al Peh of the creation of the world, but we're not seeing it in Torah SheBa'al that we recognize, and therefore the Torah SheBa'al needs to provide an answer to this also.
Actually, I mean, we just fasted on the 10th of Tavis.
Yes.
I'm sure we went to shiur and said there were 3 reasons. One of the reasons was that the Torah was translated into Greek.
Yes.
From that perspective, the world wasn't meant to have the written Torah.
It's a very interesting thing. Just again for those listening online, one of the tragedies associated with the Torah B'Tevis, the Megillas Tana says 2 days before Torah B'Tevis, on 8th of Tevis, the Torah was translated into Greek, and that's seen as a negative. That may be the case, but nonetheless, there are midrashim that indicate that there was always an awareness that Torah SheBa'al was going to spread, whereas Torah SheBa'al Peh wasn't going to spread. Additionally, it's not clear exactly what the tragedy of that story is. It may be the tragedy of the story is the mistranslation, or even the concept of translation, because translation always means distortion to some degree. No translation can fully capture the essence of what Torah is. There are indicators also the other way around. I mean, when Moshe enters into Eretz Israel, when Moshe gives the final instructions to the Jews about to enter into Eretz Israel, they're told to write these pillars with Be'er Heitev. And Rashi understands Be'er Heitev to refer to the Torah being translated into Shivim Loshen, into the 70 languages, so anyone can access the Torah. So, we talk about Shnai Mikra V'Echa Targum. Targum, according to many sources, is ascribed to not just to Targum Unclus, but to being a Halach Moshe Sinai of sorts. It's considered such a fantastic and authentic translation that it's a Halach Moshe Sinai status. And we're meant to learn the Torah, Shnai Mikra V'Echa Targum. Why Targum? Well, one answer is because Jews were speaking Aramaic and in Bovel, and if they needed to be able to access the Torah and translate it. So there may have been particular issues with either that specific translation or the way the translation was carried out, or the use of a translation without the original. We're doing Shnai Mikra V'Echa Targum, so Targum is bottled beroiv. It's we're reading it in Lashon HaKodesh and using Targum as a tool to translate it, or it may be something specific about translating into Greek as opposed to, for example, translating into Aramaic. So there are different sources and contradictions around this idea. But either way, the fact is that the non-Jewish world has accessed Torah SheBa'al, but less so Torah SheBa'al Peh. But let's probe a little bit. What is Rashi's Havamina? What's his thought that we could have survived without Sefer Bereishit? Where would that have left all of us? So in a sense, I've already given the clue to this, but I was basing this on the Ramban. So Ramban asked this question, and let's just have a look very briefly at the opening words of the Ramban. V'yesh nishal ba. One can ask about this Rashi. There's a truly a great need to start the Torah with Bereishit, because this is the foundation, the root of our faith. Anyone who doesn't believe in this, and thinks that the world is kadmon, means of ancient origin, not just ancient, but of eternal existence. In other words, always existed and wasn't brought into being by Hashem. He's denying, a heretic of the fundamentals of faith. Ve'eino Torah klal, and has no Torah whatsoever. So what exactly does Rashi mean by suggesting that Bereishit shouldn't have existed? And the answer of the Ramban resolves the question of Rashi, but is radical in the extreme in how he explains what Rashi was thinking, how Rashi thought that the Torah could exist without Bereishit, without the Sefer Bereishit? And the Ramban answers, and he says, but to Shuvah, the answer is, listen to this carefully, because this is really, really important. And again, I'll just post the link in case anyone online didn't manage to download this all, because this is a really important thought. Says the Ramban, but to Shuvah, the answer is, this is in paragraph in source 2, the third line of source 2, but to Shuvah, Master Bereishit, Soid Omuk. The creation of the world, Master Bereishit, the description of the creation of the world, is a deep secret. It's not understandable from the Psukim, and it can't be understood with clarity, only based on tradition. And therefore the Torah didn't need to begin from any earlier. So Ramban is telling us, and in a moment we'll have to ponder how much of the story is included in this. But the Ramban says, Maaseh Bereishit, the description of the creation of the world, is different to the rest of the Torah. You can't just look at the description at the story of Maaseh Bereishit and understand it in any real way. The only way it can be understood is through Mipia Kabbalah, through tradition. It's Sod Omuk, it's a deep secret. The rest of the Torah, in some shape or form, can be understood somewhat, even without Masorah, even without a tradition. Now, we've spoken before about what Torah SheBa'al Peh is, and more of Torah SheBa'al Peh than perhaps we realize is based on Sforah, is based on us humans trying to understand what the Torah is saying. But nonetheless, a significant part of Torah SheBa'al Peh is based on tradition. Having said that, the Ramban says the rest of the Torah you can understand on some level without Torah SheBa'al Peh. That means to say what we say in Mikra Yotzi Midei Peshatoi, Torah is understood on multiple levels, and therefore Torah can be read on the Peshat level. And yes, we need the addition of Chazal and the Masorah in order to understand Remez and Drush and Soid, the deeper layers of the meaning of the Torah. Nonetheless, it can be understood on a Peshat level without Torah SheBa'al Peh. But Sefer Bereishit, says the Ramban, can only be understood with the Torah SheBa'al Peh. It can only be understood with the Masorah. Why? Because it's a Soid Omuk, it's a deep secret, and therefore almost the Ramban is saying that Sefer Bereishit or Maaseh Bereishit can't be understood with the normal rule of a Mikra Yotzi Midei Peshatoi. You can't be understood with the normal tools of Peshat, of Pashtanut, of Parshanut, of reading the Pesukim and understanding them, because it's a Soid Omuk, it's a deep secret. Therefore, says the Ramban in his argument, that since we anyway are relying on Torah SheBa'al Peh, what's the point of Sefer Bereishit or Maaseh Bereishit? We anyway are relying on Torah SheBa'al Peh to understand it. The rest of the written Torah understands why there's a Torah SheB'al and a Torah SheBa'al Peh. That's actually an interesting question for us to pause and think about. Torah SheB'al, I understand. Torah SheBa'al Peh, I understand. But why do we have both? There's some partnership between the two. We need both of them. Torah SheB'al gives me some understanding of the truth, at least on a Peshat level. And then on the deeper level, I need Torah SheBa'al Peh, tell me understand the Midrashim, help me understand the secrets behind it, perhaps to apply it to Halach and Amaisa on a practical halachic level. But there's something in understanding it on a Peshat level. The Sefer Bereishit, the answer doesn't apply, because Maaseh Bereishit is a Soid Omuk. It can't be understood on it's a deep secret, it can't be understood on a Peshat level. And therefore, if we anyway need to come onto Torah SheBa'al Peh in order to understand it, why have it written at all? What's the written text doing for us? And in his understanding of the answer of Rashi, the response is, you're right. The whole of Maaseh Bereishit is a Soid, is a deep secret. In truth, we anyway need Torah SheBa'al Peh to understand it. But there's one message at least you can take out of it. Just one small detail you can take out of it. Koyach Masov, the power of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's deeds. Therefore, Losses and Nachal Esoim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the ruler of the world and is right to allocate it to whom he wants. And that's the only part of Maaseh Bereishit that can be learned on a Peshat level. So the Ramban here has told us several things. The first thing the Ramban has told us is a reading of Rashi. Rashi always understood that Sefer Bereishit is enormously important. However, Rashi didn't understand why it needs to be Torah SheB'al. It should have been Torah SheBa'al Peh. That's Rashi's question. It should have been Torah SheBa'al Peh. It should have been the oral Torah. The answer to the question is, there's one thing we can take out of Sefer Bereishit or Maaseh Bereishit, even without understanding anything else, which is Hashem created the world and he owns the world. So that's one level the Ramban says. The second thing the Ramban says is truly radical. And this Ramban is often quoted, and the radicalism of it, I think, is often missed. Because the Ramban is telling us that you have to learn Sefer Bereishit differently to the rest of those, Maaseh Bereishit at least, differently to the rest of the Torah. It can only be learned as equivalent to Torah SheBa'al Peh. It can only be learned with Torah SheBa'al Peh. It's almost as if he's saying it can only be learned as Remez, Drush, and Soid. You can't just read it on the Peshat level and expect to understand anything from it. He's saying that the whole of my Sefer Bereishit is impossible to understand. It's almost worthless that it's written because there's nothing you can draw out of Peshat from it other than the Koich Masaf Hikinami. That Hashem is the boss. God is the boss. He owns everything. Beyond that, any other detail you want to specify, it needs to be read as Midrash. Most of Bereishit needs to be read as Torah SheBa'al Peh. The way we read a Midrash, it can't be read the way we read the Pshuto Shel Mikra in the rest of the Torah. Now, this is radical. I want to emphasize the rest of the Torah can be read as Pshuto Shel Mikra. That means we read the story and we understand Korach said this and Moshe responded that and so on and so forth. The details, the subtext, what was Korach really thinking, what the Meraglim really engaging in. The text of the Torah is very limited. It only tells us a very brief version of the story. We need Torah SheBa'al Peh for more insight, but we can read it on the Peshat level. Even in the halachic realm, with limits, we can and should read the Torah on a Peshat level. For example, the Ramban in his Sefer Mitzvahs, one way of understanding the Ramban when he lists the 613 commandments is that something can only qualify as one of the 613 commandments if it's found as a discrete commandment in Torah SheBa'al in the written Torah. The details of the 613 commandments, we need analysis of the Gemara and halachic literature and the whole flourishing of Torah SheBa'al Peh to understand. But the structure of the skeleton of Torah, the 248 and 365, 630 mitzvahs of the Torah, the structure of the Torah has to be found in the Pshuto Shel Mikra, in the simple understanding of Torah SheBa'al. That which is learned through Torah SheBa'al Peh, whether it's halacha and Moshe Sinai, tradition, whether it's drashas through the hermeneutical principles, whatever exactly that means, through the principles of Rabbi Shmuel, of Kal Chomen, of Gezeiah Shava, through the sorts of resources that the Gemara uses to draw information out of Torah SheBa'al using drashas and the like, that the Rambam says can't create new mitzvahs. It can't create the skeleton, the structure of the body of the Torah. The body of the Torah is fixed with Torah SheBa'al. It gives us a beginning of an indication of the relationship between Torah SheBa'al and the written Torah and the oral Torah. The written Torah remains the structure as much as there's the aggregation and the loading of extra meaning which Torah SheBa'al Peh puts on it. This, says the Ramban, can be applied in Torah in everything post Ma'aseh Bereishis, but Ma'aseh Bereishis is a sod omuk, it's a deep secret, and therefore it can't be learnt in Pshuto Shel Mikra. This is not a forum here to go into things that we've discussed at great length on other occasions around Torah and science and some of the broader issues around the story of the creation of the world and many ways of understanding that. And I'm not going to use this forum therefore to discuss that, other than to say when one does engage in such discussion, this Ramban is surely an important Maramakim, because he's telling us that Ma'aseh Bereishis can't be learnt in the normal tools of Pshuto Shel Mikra. We need to understand that this is different. It can only be learnt as a Torah SheBa'al Peh ultimately sourced piece of information, rather than as simple Pshuto Shel Mikra. Interestingly, and the Ramban isn't entirely clear on this, how far does this carry on? Because this is also interesting. Because Rashi, of course, asks this question all the way to HaChodesh Hazeh Elochem Rosh Chodashim. Now, Ma'aseh Bereishis is a technical term the Ramban is using. Ma'aseh Bereishis means the story of creation, and it's used by Chazal, that term. There's Ma'aseh Bereishis and Ma'aseh Merkava, the story of Bereishis, creation of the world, and the story of the Merkava. Merkava means the chariot. It means the way that the divine manifests itself in the world. An image is used of a rider, as if HaKadosh Baruch Hu is riding the world and using the world as a vehicle to manifest the divine presence. So these two areas of Torah, the bringing of the world into existence and the continued hashgacha and manifestation of the divine in the world, are referred to as Ma'aseh Bereishis and Ma'aseh Merkava. And Chazal already say these are deep secrets which you can't teach to every person. There are limitations about how much they can be taught because they contain soid. This is the name of the soid of the Torah, the secrets of the Torah. And some of them can only be taught where the teacher gives over to the students Roshei Parakim, the headlines, the chapter headings, and the student has to understand from themselves the inner content, because these are such subtle ideas that they almost can't be conveyed from one person to another. By the way, in Judaism, whenever we refer to something as a soid, as a secret, we mean it's fundamentally a soid, it's fundamentally a secret. What makes something a secret? A secret is only a secret as much as I haven't told you. As soon as I tell you, it's no longer a secret because now you know it. And if I know it, it's not a secret to me, it's a secret to you because you don't yet know it. When we talk about the soid in the Torah, we don't mean it happens to be a secret because I happen not to have told you. We mean it's fundamentally a secret because it's fundamentally something that can only be understood in an inner space. It's not something that I can just tell you and then you know the secret. It's something which I can walk you round and round, but you have to enter the space yourself. And therefore, the teacher can only give over the chapter headings, the Rosh Hashirakim, and the student has to understand it themselves because it involves an inner experience and an inner world and perhaps a prophetic or meditative experience, and therefore it's an inner content that can't be told openly. So when the Ramban says that the Mitzvah Bereishit, the story of creation, is a soid omuk, is a deep secret, he's not really saying anything controversial. That's Chazal referred to this as the soid of Torah, the secrets of the Torah. The Ramban's chiddush here is, therefore, I don't understand why it's Torah SheBa'al. Since it can't be conveyed through any normal means, why is it part of the written Torah? But Mitzvah Bereishit is a technical term which is normally taken to be understood just as the story of creation. As an aside, the Rambam famously has a different understanding of Mitzvah Bereishit and Mitzvah Nekava. The Rambam understands it to mean scientific and philosophical understanding of the world, or what's often referred to as physics and metaphysics. The opponents of the Rambam criticize this understanding very strongly. They don't like this explanation. The Vilna Gaon famously critiques the Rambam and says the Rambam was over-influenced by the philosophy of the Greeks. But in the Rambam's understanding, Mitzvah Bereishit also has a technical meaning, and he also understands its secrets in the sense that it can only truly be conveyed through chapter headings and not fully explained and so on. So however one understands the term, whether as the Mekabolim, the Kabbalists understand it, or whether as the philosophers and the Rambam understands it, it's a technical term referring to Mitzvah Bereishit, to the creation of the world. Here, though, the Ramban seems to be using this idea to explain the whole of Sefer Bereishit and even the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim up to HaChodesh Elochem, up to the first mitzvah given to the Jewish people. Because the Ramban here is saying that this is the pshat of Rashi, this is the explanation of Rashi. Rashi says, why bother with the whole of Sefer Bereishit? Surely Sefer Bereishit is necessary, says the Ramban. Answers the Ramban, the explanation of Rashi is that, he doesn't say this explicitly, but seeming this is what he means, the whole of Sefer Bereishit is ultimately part of Mitzvah Bereishit. It's all part of bringing the world into existence. The 6 days of creation are bringing creation into existence, the physical world into existence. The continuation of the story is about bringing humanity into existence, bringing the Jewish people into existence. So it's all part of the creation story of the world. It's all Sefer Bereishit. It's all called Sefer Yetzirah, the book of Genesis, the book of creation. And therefore, the Ramban seems to be implying that Rashi's question applies, as Rashi says it, applies to the whole of Sefer Bereishit. The whole of Sefer Bereishit can't be understood in the normal tools of Pshuto Shel Mikra, but can only be understood as Soid Omuk, as a deep secret, which is Eino Muvan Min HaMikra, can't be understood from the Psukim. Again, I want to follow the injunction of Chazal, and rather than saying this explicitly, only say this implicitly as headlines, as chapter headings, and everyone understand this themselves. If this is the case, then the Ramban is telling us that the whole of Sefer Bereishit can't be learnt as the normal tools of Pshuto Shel Mikra, but has to be understood as a soid, which needs to be understood in a certain way, obviously in line with an authentic understanding of the Masorah and of Torah SheBa'al Peh. But the whole of Sefer Bereishit needs to be read as Midrash, as on the Drush and Remez and Soid level, rather than as Pshuto Shel Mikra in the normal way. If you expect to learn Mitzvah Bereishit, and perhaps, as seems to be the simplest understanding of the Ramban, the whole of Sefer Bereishit, just with the normal tools of Parsha, the normal tools of Peshat, we're not going to get there. Because this is integral, this is in its essence Torah SheBa'al Peh, something which needs to be conveyed through Torah SheBa'al Peh rather than Torah SheBa'al itself. Hence Rashi's question, what's the point of it all? And Rashi's answer, indeed, the only information you can draw out from the whole of Sefer Bereishit on Pshuto Shel Mikra level is Hashem's in control. He's in control, he created the world, he's in control that he brought the marble, he's in control that he brought the Afraga, he's in control that he was entitled to create a covenant with a family, with an individual, and then a family. He's in control that he can manipulate the history of the family and the history of the whole of Egypt to get that family down to Egypt and to take them out of Egypt, the whole story of Yetzias Mitzrayim. All of that, all you can take out of it from that is Hashem has the moral authority over the world and therefore can allocate that Israel to whom he wants. And Chodesh Elochem, that's when we can start applying the normal tools of Pshuto Shel Mikra. So seems that the Ramban to say.
If the Ramban really means that, then all the rest of his commentary after the creation story itself, all the stories of Yaakov and Moshe, it kind of invalidates his commentaries, because he's saying the way he's explaining it and the way he explains the rest of the Torah, he shouldn't be allowed to do that, because he's saying,
Well, it's very interesting. The question that's asked to those online is, doesn't this invalidate the rest of the Ramban's Perish and the whole of Sefer Bereishit? It's very interesting because, one of the themes I've tried to explore over the last few shiurim is what we mean exactly by Pshat. Now, the Ibn Ezra and the Rashbam, and perhaps some of the modern day Parshanut and Pashtanut that's engaged in, are arguing that you can find meaningful Pshat in the Pesukim just by looking at the Pesukim. The Ibn Ezra was not a Karaite. He didn't disagree with the Masorah of Chazal. The Rashbam was not Chas v'Shalom Tzedoki. He didn't disagree with Torah SheBa'al Peh. He simply said that you can learn Torah Sheba'al on a Pshat level and draw something meaningful out of the text, ignoring the insight of Chazal and the Masorah as we have it, and we can just read it as it is. The Ramban and Rashi took a different stance to the matter. Rashi understood that even the Pshat can only be understood with some of the insights of Midrash. What Rashi does so skillfully and wonderfully is demonstrate how the Midrashim answer and resolve the reading of the Psukim and the textual nuances in that, in the famous "What's bothering Rashi" question, the problems that Rashi is identifying in Peshat. So Rashi is, broadly speaking, spotting the same sorts of grammatical and contextual and language problems as perhaps the Ibn Ezra or the Rashbam are doing. But Rashi is saying the way to deal with this is to try and skillfully weave and pick the relevant Midrashim out that come to answer those questions. Rashi almost divides Midrash into Midrash, which is just Drush or just Remez or just Soid, and Midrash, which is necessary for Pshat. The Ramban is different to Rashi, but also adopts a stance that is somewhat analogous to that. The Ibn Ezra and the Rashbam don't. The Ibn Ezra and the Rashbam say you can just read the Pesukim. So the Ramban at least is saying that seems to be saying that when it comes to Sefer Bereishit, here I don't accept the legitimacy of an Ibn Ezra or Rashbam type reading. The rest of the Torah is not what I'm doing, it's not what I'm choosing to do, but there is a authoritative reading that you can make on that level. When it comes to Sefer Bereishit, it can only be learnt as with weaving the Midrashim in. And this is part of what we've spoken about, that really there's a meta machlokas, a meta argument going on between the Rishonim as to what Torah is. And part of that meta argument is, how does Torah SheBa'al, the written Torah, relate to Torah SheBa'al Peh, the oral Torah? So that's what the Ramban says. And again, for a wise person, a hint is enough. This is a radical Ramban really in how to learn Sefer Bereishit, and I think a very, very important Maramokim in according to the Ramban of how we're meant to understand it. Now, what can we say about this on a halachic level, and where else can we take this Ramban? So it's very interesting because the truth is we learn an awful amount from Sefer Bereishit. The Ramban says that we could have and should have learnt all of this from Torah SheBa'al Peh, but because of a particular reason, as Rashi explains, it needed to be put in Torah SheBa'al. But what is the content of this Torah SheBa'al Peh that it contains? What else is the Torah SheBa'al Peh that should have been in the oral Torah, but instead ended up in the written Torah of Sefer Bereishit? So again, on a Peshat, Rashi in the Ramban's reading is not saying that the whole point of Sefer Bereishit is just to tell us Hashem is control. The whole point of the writtenness, the bichsavness of Sefer Bereishit is just to tell us that Hashem is control. But there's an awful amount that Sefer Bereishit tells us, an awfully important amount of information it tells us, but that simply can only really be conveyed with Torah SheBa'al Peh, and therefore Rashi is questioning what the point of the Torah Shebichsav is in it. Why did it need to be written? We shouldn't draw out of either of these sources that the only thing we can derive from Sefer Bereishit is that Hashem is in control. The remaining stories of the Mabul and the Aflaga and the Ovis and even the description of the creation of the world has tons to teach us. It's radically important. It's just that it should have been taught through Torah SheBa'al Peh, not through Torah SheBa'al. That's the question they're asking. So what other content is there in this that should have been taught through Torah SheBa'al Peh and instead was taught through Torah SheBa'al? So the story of the 6 days of creation we're going to put on hold. That's Mitzvah Bereishit. It teaches us philosophy, mysticism, Kabbalah. Listen to the Sunday morning shiur or whichever other forum we discuss these ideas in. But that's what the story of creation is. But what about the rest of the Sefer Bereishit? What is the message of it, which should have been oral Torah and instead is written Torah? And why should all of that have been oral Torah? So the next source I want to share is a very famous and well-known Netziv, Hamek Dover. Again, it's oft quoted, but I think some of the nuance of it is misunderstood often. I want to spend the remainder of the shiur really trying to analyze what he says in a little more depth. So this source is a source 3 on the handout sheet, and it comes from the Hamek Dover, which is the commentary of Reb Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the Netziv of Velozhin. So the Netziv of Velozhin was a grandson-in-law of Reb Chaim Velozhin. He was the Rosh Yeshiva of the mother of yeshivas, the Velozhiner yeshiva. He wrote an extraordinary number of very, very important works, including the Hamek Dover, which we were talking about Parsha, the renewed and resurgent interest in Pshuto Shel Mikra. It's very interesting. The Jewish history goes in waves. If you learn Chazal, we don't find them really discussing Pshuto Shel Mikra, the simple meaning of the psukim, in any great depth. We don't know why. Is it because they weren't interested in it? They considered it a lower level of Torah. It was obvious for them, and therefore they didn't bother engaging in it. But we don't have much from Chazal about Pshat. They engaged in Medrash, they engaged in halachic drash, and halachic Medrash, and Agadah Medrash, but we don't really find much about Pshat. In the generation post-Rashi, there's a resurgence of interest in Pshat, of which the two most prominent advocates are, of course, the Ibn Ezra and the Rashbam. But of course, even Rashi is already at the beginning of this shift from Medrash to Pshat. By the way, it's very interesting. An era is often closed by a work which does such a conclusive and brilliant summary of everything that went ahead of it, that the era, that the next generations almost shift in what they engage and engage in an interpretation of that rather than in continued pursuit of that. So what brought about the start of the Gemara era? The closure of the Mishnah. You now had the sum totality of halacha of Torah SheBa'al Peh summarized in this very brief bullet point type text, which is the Mishnah. And now, therefore, Gemara starts. What brought to an end the close of the era of the Rishonim, those who delved in Gemara to draw out halacha, really the summary of everything the Rishonim engaged in, with the encyclopedic mind of Rabbi Yosef Cairo, who in his Beis Yosef compiled everything that was written by the Rishonim, drew out the halachic conclusions, and summarized that in his Shulchan Aruch, which is another new Mishnah of sorts. Again, it's a bullet point summary of everything. And just like there's a Gemara that follows the Mishnah, in which the Amoraim analyze the Mishnah, rather than going back to primary sources, in a sense, post the era of the Shulchan Aruch, the later commentaries are now more about the Achronim, are more about analyzing the Rishonim and analyzing the Shulchan Aruch, rather than taking them forward. In some respects, I would argue that once Rashi became canonized and became the classic text, he almost brought to a close the era of Midrash, in a sense. Rashi, in a sense, can be viewed as the last of the Midrashic works and the first of the Peshat works, because he took the whole of Midrash, he drew out those Midrashim which carry the Torah with them, and this is why Rashi became Rashi, why he became the Av HaMefarshim. He showed to the minds of the era of the Rishonim how these Midrashim resolved and were built on nuances of the text. And in a sense, I would argue that the success of Rashi in some ways ushered in the era of Parsha. Ibn Ezra was not influenced by Rashi, but the Rashbam certainly was influenced by Rashi. And perhaps that brought the resurgence of interest in Pshat. And as much as the Ramban is engaged, has a different picture of Pshat to the Ibn Ezra or the Rashbam, he's also engaged very significantly with Pshat. If we go then to the early era of the Achronim, the interest in Pshat recedes, and one finds again new Agadah type works. The Arachaim is a proponent of that, the Safarim of the Hasidim are proponents of that. There isn't really significant engagement with Pshat. And then suddenly in the 1800s, there's a renewed interest in Pshat, and you have this flurry of Pshat works. You have the Netziv, the Hamek Dover, which is the Sefer I'm mentioning now. You have the Meshech Chochmah, which we've discussed often. You have the Ksav Kabbalah, you have the Torah Mima, you have the Samson Raphael Hirsch, of course, and the Malbim, and many, many others. And there's a renewed resurgence in Pshuto Shel Mikra in Peshat, really till the First World War. Then the engagement with Peshat really goes quiet again until really the last 10 years or 15 years or so, which there's again been a renewed interest and resurgence in Parsha and Peshat and so on and so forth. So very interesting how things go in waves. The Hamek Dover is an enormously important work in the context of that 1800s wave of renewed interest in Peshat. The Netziv was an exceptionally prolific author. He wrote many other works, including Hamak Sheila, a commentary on the She'ultas, a Gaonic work, and numerous others. What's interesting about the Netziv, I'll just share in this forum two pieces of information about him. First, he was known as the Netziv, the initials of his name, Naftali Tzvi Berlin, and from the descriptions that we have of him, he indeed was a prince amongst men. He was a princely figure. Also, interestingly, in a world in which we used to Godel stories telling us about the enormous talent of Gedolim from a very young age and their Eloishkeit, their Gaonis, their genius, and that's not surprising. Many of the Gedolim, it's not surprising there's a whole genre of literature which emphasizes their genius, because many of them are geniuses. But the Netziv was not known for being a genius. In fact, there's stories told about him in which it seems he wasn't a particularly talented youth. Apparently he was okay, but he wasn't a particularly talented youth. Even after he married into the Velozhin royal dynasty, married the granddaughter of Rabbi Velozhin, he wasn't considered the daughter of Rabbi Velozhin wasn't considered the granddaughter. He wasn't considered the most talented of the sons-in-law, and yet he became the most prolific and important of them all. He ended up not only as the Rosh Yeshiva of Velozhin, but also the author of enormously important works, and seems to have got there with presumably a significant amount of talent, but not through sparks of genius, but through sheer hard work and determination. A very, very inspirational figure. Now, the Netziv, in his commentary on the Torah, wrote an introduction to Sefer Bereishit. In fact, to all the Sfarim, he wrote an introduction. And one of the things he does is explore the alternative names of these works. And we know that even though we refer to the books of the Torah as Bereishit, Shmos, VaYikra, Bamidbar, Dvarim, Chazal didn't call them that. Chazal had other names for them. In fact, the Christian tradition preserves the names in Latin that Chazal gave to them. So Bereishit was known as Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation, or Genesis. Shemos was known as Sefer Geula, the book of Exodus. VaYikra, Torah Kohanim, which they translate as Leviticus, the Torah of the Levium rather than the Torah of the Kohanim. Bamidbar is Sefer Pekudim, translated as Numbers. Devarim is Mishnah Torah, the repetition of the Torah, Deuteronomy, the second Torah. So Chazal had a different set of names, and then the Netziv explores these names. But here he doesn't explore the name of Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation, but another name given to Sefer Bereishit, which is Sefer HaYashar, the book of the straight. Now, I plan to read this Netziv inside, but perhaps I spent too much time rambling about who the Netziv was, and therefore I'm not going to read it inside. I would humbly and strongly suggest that everyone, if you have the chance afterwards, to look at this Netziv inside. But the basic thesis of the Netziv is that it is called Sefer HaYashar because it is designed to teach us the midah of yashrus, of being straight, how a person should behave in a yashar manner. And he brings sources at the beginning where we find it referred to as Sefer HaYashar, as the book of Yashar. In fact, Nach itself already calls Sefer Bereishit Sefer HaYashar. So this isn't a Chazal name, this is a very early name. When the Nevi'im referenced the Torah itself, or Sefer Bereishit itself, they called it Sefer HaYashar. So if you want to know what a Jew in the era of Yehoshua called Sefer Bereishit, you refer to it, at least Yehoshua did, as Sefer HaYashar. Who are these figures who are the characters of Sefer HaYashar? They are the Yeshorim, they are the straight ones. And again, he brings sources. Bilam refers to the Avos, to our forefathers, and Imois as the Yeshorim. Again, he brings the sources where we find Bilam referring to them as Yeshorim. And he says, what is this midah, this quality of Yashrus? I mean, great people have many names. They can be referred to Sadiqim, righteous people, Kadoshim, holy people, Chasidim, pious people. Nowadays, Gaonim, geniuses, right? We give whichever term we want to give to great individuals. But the Torah in Bilam and Yehoshua, when he refers to Bereishit, refers to them as Yeshorim. These are people who are Yashar, who are straight. And he says that the midah of Yashrus is the ability to get from A to B. A Yashar, a straight line, is a straight line is mathematically defined as the shortest route from A to B. But to get straight from A to B is what Yashrus. Yashrus is the ability to get to where you need to get to navigate there from A to B. And this is the crucial point. It's the ability to get from A to B. Just to be a tzaddik, just to be a chassid is no mean achievement. It's an amazing achievement, but it's still just to be. Because a Yashar has something else. A Yashar is able to live in the real world, is able to start off at A, is able to relate to the people around, and from there, home in and zoom straight off to B. So the Yashar is the ability to engage and navigate and belong to the world and the surroundings and interact with people and build a relationship with these people and yet still achieve the outcome that a person is meant to achieve. And he says this is the unique quality of the Avos. And Avraham Avinu, it's very difficult to be an Omot HaChesed, to be a pillar of kindness, to be a Mamin, to be a believer in a world that doesn't believe. But that's not his greatest achievement. That's very difficult, but manageable. But why do we stand in awe of Avraham Avinu? Because the same Avraham Avinu, who is the Omot HaChesed, is able to stand in front of Hashem and daven for Sodom, who represents everything that he finds repulsive, everything that's horrific to him. They are the quality, the midah of lack of kindness and selfishness and miserliness and lack of hospitality. The ability of an Avraham Avinu to interact with the Sodom, the ability of a Yitzchak to interact with an Avimelech and a Plishtim. This is what qualifies them as Yeshorim. And he adds, by the way, he says this is what was lacking in the second, at the time of the first Beis Hamikdash. The second Beis Hamikdash, who were not criticized for Avodah Zarah, Gil Arais, and Shvichas Damim like the first Beis Hamikdash were, but they lacked this midah of Yashrus. They were unable to tolerate those who were different to them and live with those who were different to them. I printed, by the way, on source 4, Rashi, who translates Yashar V'Atov as Zu Peshora. This is compromising, lifnim meshura sadin, to go beyond the letter of the law. I was at a simcha this week, and I found myself sitting next to a lawyer, and we were talking about the legal system in secular law and in halacha, and the differences between how botitin work, and so an interesting discussion. And at one point, the concept of peshura came up. And this man who is he's a genuine truth seeker, a very nice conversation, a very sincere individual who's really trying to practice his profession in a very honest way. He says he's bothered by the concept of peshara because he sees it as a distortion from the truth. Law is there to define and arrive at clarity and sort out the rights and the wrongs. And peshara, by definition, is a falsehood. It's by definition untrue because it's arriving at a result which is impossible to be true when you make a compromise. If I paskin like A, maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. If I pass like B, maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. But at least there's a 50% chance I'm right. If I make a peshara, I'm definitely wrong. There's an old Brisker joke, because Briskers enjoy truth and value truth, from Chaim Brisker, in which he said, "What's better, a clock which is 5 minutes slow, or a watch which is 5 minutes slow, or a watch which has stopped?" So he said, "Well, the watch which is 5 minutes slow is always wrong, whereas the watch which has stopped at least is right twice a day." This is this is a joke, of course, but din is at least accurate. At least if you pass like one or the other, there's a chance that it's accurate. Peshura, compromise, we would say is the farthest from Yashrus that is imaginable. And yet Rashi here, and by the way, in Chazal there is discussion around this point. Is it a reputable thing, a good thing to seek Peshura or not? Gemara in Sanhedrin discusses this, a whole sugya. But the practical conclusion is that we do seek Peshura because there's a Yashrus, a truth, that lies in peshara that doesn't lie in the strict application of din. Now you could argue the strict application of din is truer. It's true. There is a truth to din, to the strict application of halacha, but it also ends up giving one side nothing and the other side everything. And in the real world, it's often not like that. And the ability of the others to be yeshorim was the ability to even in those who are failing and awful, to recognize they still have a kiyum, they still have an existence. There's some truth to them, because otherwise they couldn't be there on planet Earth. And the quality of Yashrus, according to Rashi, is that which allows compromise. Compromise is straighter, is truer. The ability to tolerate the one who is wrong and give space for them also to exist within the parameters of halacha and everything else. That is a midah that the office represented, and this is a quality. It's very interesting because I'll say that the Beis Hamikdash was nechrav because hemidu dineim al din Torah, because the generation of the second Beis Hamikdash established their dinei Torah, their court cases on din Torah, on the law of Torah. Now you may say that's wonderful. They're keeping the din Torah. Because I was saying, it being punctualist and pedantic and detail focused on the letter of the law, and not having room for understanding that sometimes one needs to go lifnimish or something, one needs to have a little bit of compromise. That is a stira, a contradiction to the midah of Yashrus. So what the Netziv has told us, and I'm going to expand what he says really, is that there is that the Torah SheBa'al Peh of Sefer Bereishit is teaching us how to live. And this is what Rashi's asking. He says, when we need to learn how to live, qualities, midas, hachnosas orchim, yashrus and straightness that can only be taught through Torah SheBa'al Peh, that can only be taught through the oral law. So what's the point of a written Torah when it can only be taught through the oral law? And the answer to the question, I'm going to finish soon, Josh. I'm going to finish soon. The answer to the question is that it can only be taught. The question is, it can and should only be taught through Torah SheBa'al Peh. Why is it written in the Torah SheBa'al? Answer Rashi, because of Korach Masav, because of this one lesson we can learn. But in essence, the message of Yashrus of Sefer Bereishit can only be taught through the oral Torah, not the written Torah. Let me try and explain what I mean. Torah consists of two ways of conveying information. It has rules, it has laws. Woven into the laws are stories. So we have a Sefer Mishpatim, Sedra, Parsha, Mishpatim, Parsha, Shoftim, which are bullet points. They read like Mishnah and Shulchan Aruch, rules, situation, case study, rule, what to do in this, law. You have the whole of Sefer VaYechi, rules, how to bring korbanos. They read like technical manuals. Technical manuals are very good ways of conveying information, bullet points of how to run the letter of the law in contract law or in borrowing and buying and selling and responsibility for guardianship and agency and all the halachos that Mishpatim deals with. However, there's a whole section of halacha that can't be taught through bullet points. It can only be taught through character molding. And this is really the purpose of Torah SheBa'al Peh. Torah SheBa'al Peh is a learning from a real live person, a role model, someone who shows you things in action, someone who teaches real life. Again, just think about Shabbos. So we have on Shabbos, you can learn Mishnah Berurah, you can open a Mishnah Berurah, and you can learn all the laws of Shabbos. You still won't know what a Shabbos feels like. Shabbos can only be taught through Torah SheBa'al Peh, through the lived experience that's been carried through the generations from parent to child, from mother to daughter, from the lived experience of what a Shabbos looks like. And if that chain is broken and there's a Baal Sheva from seeing how one's teachers keep it, a lived experience, an immersive experience of what a Shabbos feels like. The malachos of Shabbos, muktzah of Shabbos can perhaps be taught from a book, but uvta t'chol, what's weekday type, what's Shabbostic, how Shabbos should feel is Torah SheBa'al Peh and remains to this day Torah SheBa'al Peh. The Shulchan Aruch in 1,000 pages can't teach it. If this is with Shabbos, it's so much more so when it comes to Yashrus, so much more so when it comes to lifnim meshusnim, to compromise, to achnosas orchim, to welcoming guests into the house, to the role models, the family dynamics, arguments between brothers, arguments between husband and wife, family tensions, how things are resolved, look at how Yaakov interacts with Esav. These are things which can't be taught through a written text. They can't be taught through a bullet point. So how does the Torah teach them? With stories. Because a narrative at least draws you into it. A narrative gives you a second-hand lived experience. You can't talk by following the bullet point list of how am I meant to welcome guests into my house. Smile at this point, and now I'll smile because this is what the instructions say. I have to do it because I'm immersed in experience, because I've lived what it's like and I understand what it's like. And this is the mid of Yashrus that the Netziv is drawing out as the theme of Sefer Bereishit. And in truth, a story is the only way it can be conveyed, as it draws you into it. We relive with an Avraham Avinu what achnosas orchim looks like because we're told a story of how he runs and does it. It can't be taught like Mishpatim or VaYikra is taught. It can only be taught through a narrative. But even that is only a pale copy of the real thing, because the real thing is only Torah SheBa'al Peh. It can only be learned through Torah SheBa'al Peh. And therefore, says the Ramban, the whole of Sefer Bereishit is Torah SheBa'al Peh. It can only be learned through Torah SheBa'al Peh. My Sefer Bereishit is the story of the creation of the world because it's mystical, it's a secret, it's a Sayyid Amuk. But the rest of Bereishit is also a Sayyid, it's also a secret. Because if we're trying to understand what's really going on with a Rivka and a Yitzchak and what their marriage is like, and how they're educating an Esav and a Yaakov, and where they're getting it right and where they're getting it wrong, and an Avram and a Hagar and Ishmael and Yosef and the brothers, and Achnos Orchim, all these stories, all of these things can only be taught through the lived experience of Torah SheBa'al Peh. It can only be conveyed. It can't be conveyed in the classroom. It can't be conveyed in the yeshiva or in the shiurim. It can only be explained through the Torah SheBa'al Peh of the Torah Semecha. The primary teacher of Torah is the Mechel, the mother, who gives us the immersive experience. And therefore, says Ramban, what's the point of this being written? Asked Rashi, what's the point of this being written as Torah SheBa'al, as a written Torah, when it anyway needs Torah SheBa'al Peh? I just want to finish off in the 4 minutes remaining to speak a little bit about Yashrus and what this mitzvah is. Very briefly, because we're really running out of time, or nearly running out of time. There is a pasuk, I've been to this in source 4, of Asisa HaYashar V'Atov. You should do that which is straight and good. And the Ramban comments on this pasuk that he says, I don't understand what this mitzvah of Yashrus, do that which is straight and good, is. I mean, we have a whole Torah that tells us how to behave. What's the point of an extra mitzvah that tells me do that which is straight and good? And the Ramban says, because you can keep every law in Bein Adam L'Chaveiro in human interaction and still be a thoroughly selfish and horrible individual who mistreats others. And therefore, there has to be a catch-all mitzvah of doing that, which is Yashar V'Tov, that which is straight and good. It parallels the Ramban's comments on Kadoshim to you shall be holy. At the beginning of Kadoshim to you, the Ramban says, why is there mitzvah of being holy? It's not another mitzvah, just keep the whole Torah and you will be holy. Answer Ramban, no, you can keep all the other 612 mitzvahs and not be holy, because you can be a manuval B'Rishas HaTorah, you can be a corrupt and horrible and repulsive and materialistic individual, keeping all other halachot. Therefore, you need a mitzvah of Kadoshim to you. The parallel in human interaction, in financial interaction, Bein Adam L'Chaveiro, chesed, tzedakah, welcoming guests, jealousy, kindness, vengefulness, and everything else, is Vasisa Yashar HaTov. You can keep all the technical mitzvahs in the book and still lack yashrus. And this is what Bereishit is for, and this is what Sefer Bereishit is for, and this is what ultimately remains a lived experience of Torah SheBa'al Peh. But finally, very interestingly, there's a Vilna Gaon, and I printed this in Salt 6, and again, I'll just say this outside, and Salt 7, I'll say outside. There are two terms used for that which is straight. There's the term tam and yashar. The Vilna Gaon is commenting on Mishli, which talks about tam v'yashar. And he says, what is the difference between these two terms? And he says, tam hu ha'holich b'tmimus, when it goes with the simplicity, with the straightness, but in the way of the Torah. It's almost instinctive. V'yashar hu, someone who's yashar, is a som midos of b'sichlo, someone who moderates and directs and channels their midas, how they behave with seichel. V'zer ha'yashar, and this straight person, yachol lipol b'reshes ha'yetzirah, can more easily fall into the trap of the Yetzer Hara. Very interesting. So tam is someone who has intuited, has embedded, who's made instinctive their ability to be straight, to walk straight. A yashar is someone who's doing it with an intellectual allocation of how they behave. Now, there's a danger in this sichli intellectual allocation of your midas, because you can end up corroded and self-delusions and fall into the trap of the Yetzer Hara. Nonetheless, there's a quality to it because it's apportioned and worked out. Now, one way of viewing the journey of Yaakov's life is from being a tam to being a yashar. He's described in a very young age as a ish tam yoshev eholim. One explanation of his name Yaakov, linked to Akev, a heel, is like when we walk, we just walk without thought. He instinctively is a good fellow. He's instinctively a great person. He's instinctively a good person. He's a tam, he's someone who's got that natural straightness that the Vilna Gaon describes. And by the way, the Hebrew word for regel, foot, is perhaps linked to herigel, that which is just that we do instinctively and automatically and on autopilot, because we walk on autopilot. Yaakov moves through his life and he ends up as a yashar, as someone who has to struggle to arrive at straightness. Why does this happen? Because he wrestles with the Sorish Esav, right? He has to integrate Esav. He has to also be able to connect and bring an Esav into his life. He struggles with the Sarshel Esav. He now gets the new name of Yisrael. He's Sarisa because you have struggled. He now becomes a Yashar, someone who has arrived at the straightness because they are able to not just be tam, not just do that which is right because it's right, but they're able also to make a pshara. They are also able to give space for those who are wrong and bring them into their world of yashras. There's a danger in that one can more easily fall into the trap of the Yetzer Hara, but there's a strength in that because that is what we're meant to be. We're not the people of Tam. We're not the people of Yaakov. We're Yisrael. We're Bnei Yisrael. We're the people of Yashrus, of Sarisa, who struggle to arrive at that which is true because we are negotiating, we are talking, we're engaging with the other side. And this is the message of Sefer HaYashar, of Sefer Bereishit, which remains Torah SheBa'al Peh, remains oral law, has to remain a lived experience. It can't be something which the written text can ever fully convey. And this was the achievement of Yaakov, an achievement that has a danger, because when you're engaging with the other side, you can fall into the trap. But it's what Yaakov needed in order to become Yisrael. And with his becoming Yisrael, really Sefer Bereishit concludes. When Bnei Yisrael ceased to just be Yaakov and a family, but became Bnei Yisrael, that's when Sefer Bereishit had reached its purpose. Sefer HaYashar could now be closed, and Sefer Shemos could now start. So Chazak, we finished Sefer Bereishit, and next week we start with Sefer Shemos, the story of Klal Yisrael once they're already Bnei Yisrael.
Thank you very, very much, Rabbi Zobin. Very good.
And I think there's a connection between. Yes. One translation of Yisrael is Yashar. Yes, it's the middle of Yashrus, linked to the word Sarisa, a struggle, as the Vilna Gaon identifies that it's not the easy middle of, the great middle of Tam. Halavai would all be Tam, but the middle of Yashar. Yeah.
what to say there.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah. The mystics, by the way, say it's not coincidence that the two Bali Plugdon explaining the Gemara, the two tefillin that we wear are Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam. Rashi is Yashar at the middle of Yashar, Rabbeinu Tam is Yaakov in the middle of Tam, but that's a broader discussion for another time. Yes, sorry.
Rabbi Zobin, so when is Klal Israel called Israel and when is it called Yaakov? So what's the difference then? When are we called in the Torah when we say to speak to Bnei Israel or to speak to Bnei Yaakov? What is when is what?
It's a good question. In general, it's one of the answers to the question is that exactly this theme we're talking about. In fact, we had a guest speaker in there who spoke on Shabbos, who I believe addressed a bit this topic also. One way of answering this question, if you look in the Psukim, is that whenever Yaakov is walking in Yaakov mode, where things are going instinctively, then he is referred to as Yaakov. And when it's the quality of Sarisa, where one needs to struggle, but then arrive at a deeper truth, an emes la'amito, not just a theoretical truth, but truth that works in the real world, which is the quality of pshara, then he's referred to as Yisrael.
Okay.
Where do you see in Yaakov's life that he is the Yoshar?
It's very interesting because Akev, of course, has another meaning also, right? Like he tricked me and distorted me. It's interesting, Titting the emes Yaakov, the Pasuk describes Yaakov as having the middle of emes, even though he spends a lot of his life having to deal with duplicity with others, with Esav, and then with Lavan. And it seems this ties in also to this idea that our picture of truth is a truth that can work in the real world, not just a truth that's sort of a theoretical truth that isn't actually applicable, isn't actually manageable in how real life is.
So we can see Pshara rather than
Pshara, that's correct. You see Yashrus as opposed to Tam, yeah, that's correct.
Exactly.
Yaakov works through the Esav story and the Lavan story, and he moves away from Tam to Yasha. Yeah, that's one way of reading the story.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you. Good evening.
One answer to your lawyer friend is that most
Yeah.
legal systems had to develop